Now I'm going to change gears on you a minute. Most of us think that the legacy of African people in the Americas begins with slave ships arriving on these shores and bringing African people. That's what most people in the United States think. While it is true that there is evidence showing that many Africans were indeed captured off the coast of West Africa, places like Gorée Island, and brought to the West Indies and brought to the Americas, it is also true that many Africoid peoples were already here. Now, we've had people like Ivan van Sertima who've talked about this, and they came before Columbus, and then in his edited work, The African Presence in Early America. But before him, before Brother van Sertima, there were Europeans who were saying the same thing, like Leo Weiner, and people like John McIntosh, who was writing in the middle of the 19th century, the Indians of North America, and basically pointed out, these people are related to Africans. These people are related to Ethiopians. Now, Alexander von Wulfenau, who was the German art historian, who wrote the book Unexpected Faces in Ancient America, it's basically a pictorial history and a revelation about the African presence in pre-Columbian America. And it's no accident that this information, although it was part of American folklore at one time, is increasingly denied, and an emphasis is placed upon the idea of African peoples all being brought here on slave ships. Now, this particular artifact or statuette, referred to as an old man with hat, this is from Alexander von Wulfenau's book, is from the classic period, which is between 300 and 900 of the Common Era. This is from Veracruz in Mexico. Now, I don't know about what you see, but that looks like a brother wearing a fez. It looks like something wrong. Now, I don't know. I'm just saying, von Wulfenau makes the same contention that when he looks at some of these statuettes, these artifacts, he says they speak for themselves. And he talks about how a man who was at the Smithsonian named Dr. Alex Hrdlicka, who was in charge of the ethnography department, did everything he could to hide those statuettes, those artifacts, which showed African features, or Africoid features, and how he ensured that you would not get a job as an ethnographer, not only at the Smithsonian Institute, but at any legitimate, quote-unquote, ethnographical institution, anthropological institution in the country, if you challenge that. This is what von Wulfenau talks about. So there was obviously an attempt to hide this information from folks. This second one, all right now. See, brother said, looks like Joe Frazier. This kneeling figure. Now, why he's kneeling, I mean, we don't know. Was he working? Was he praying? Was he meditating? Of course, I can't get into the mind of the sculptor, the person who put that together, but it sure is interesting when you consider that with all the other information. So you got to tie everything in together. And this kneeling figure is from the Olmec, and it's from Guatemala. So we're not talking again about, people tend to just focus perhaps on Mexico with the Olmec heads at Tres Zapotes a la Venta. But this is from Guatemala. And it actually is from 600 BCE. This early Negroid, as Van Ruthenau put it, and I will forgive him on this because he's produced so much information, assistance, but this early Negroid representation from Morelos, Mexico. Again, this is from the Archaic era. And Archaic, when they just dated as Archaic, is at some time between 2000 BCE and 100 BCE. We don't know, but it's old. And this is from, as I already said, it's from Mexico. This vessel is from the post-classic period, which is between 900 and 1500 of the Common Era, and this is from Costa Rica. And again, we see this evidence of African peoples and the Africoid features throughout Central and South America. This is also from the Olmec era, from Tres Zapotes. As is this. And this is also, this is from, well, you can see it actually in Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus, as well as in Van Ruthenau's text. And I like what he did in comparing the chief, the Nuba chief, with the features of this Olmec monument. And those things stand between 7 and 9 feet tall. And some, in fact, are actually larger. It's another. These are all right here in the Americas, and all predate Columbus. This is an Arapaho Indian brother. And this, again, is something that should cause us to pause. When you read references like Hernan Lopez de Castaneda, who wrote a book in the 15th century in which he referred to the peoples living in Panama as part of an Ethiopian tribe, which means that they must have looked like African people. And this was essentially what Europeans met when they arrived. When you see references to the Arawak and the Carib Indians, who are thought to be, as the Europeans used to say, Mohammedans, because of their attire and their customs. And when Columbus's own son refers to these things, it should compel you to pause and ask, were we already here before the Europeans arrived? When you consider the fact that when Columbus himself met what he called the King of Cuba, he began to speak, or his translators began to speak immediately with these people. Now, on board the ship were people that spoke Arabic, Chaldean, and Hebrew. Now, for them to start conversing right away seems kind of peculiar, unless the languages were either one of those three or were at least Semitic, as we would say, and fought together, intermarried, etc. But I submit, when you consider the evidence, maybe those people who fled had already been there. If you consider the term Indian now, and let me just, this is something again to help you perhaps understand how to reinterpret the term Indian when you go and do some research on your own, which I hope you'll do. At one time, the Europeans used the term Indian or Indias to refer to African people. Now, a lot of folks didn't even know that. It's like, really? Oh, yes. Absolutely. And when people in the early 19th century were reading a book called A Sketch of an African Indian, 1822 by Salop Wellington, and you look at the images, they even give you, pictures. A sketch of an African Indian. They're talking about people from Gambia. The book is about a Gambian, but he's called an African Indian. Given that, what does that make us think when you go back and imagine when Europeans talked about Indians in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries? How did those people look? We assume that they would have looked like the dime store, the cigar store, or dime store Indian. You have to be reddish brown in complexion with straight black hair, aquiline nose, right? Well, that is a legitimate phenotype of an Indian. But when you go back and you read court cases of Indians like the Narragansetts, who lived up in Rhode Island, and you hear people testifying, the Narragansetts, as long as we knew, were always very curly and had very curly hair and dark complexions. You can hardly tell them from the so-called Negroes. So when people reveal something like that, they're saying, wait a minute, you might want to reconsider what this term Indian was talking about. Right?